We'd like to welcome everyone to the SAIS Rethinking Iran initiative at JHU. Bilateral relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia have been strained over several geopolitical issues. The two countries broke diplomatic ties in 2016, but have recently engaged in a number of direct negotiations to talk about and resolve regional issues. Today, we're here to talk about these developments and to think about the future of Iran-Saudi relations. We're very excited to have a really terrific lineup of scholars and experts to discuss this issue with us for the next hour. Dr. HESHAM ALGHANNAM is a Saudi political scientist and Fulbright scholar. He's a senior research fellow at the Gulf Research Center and a geopolitical expert and strategy advisor. He's written on the political economy of the GCC states, Iran's nuclear program, the Treaty on Nuclear Non-Proliferation, and on the political conflicts between the GCC and Iran. Maria Fantapi is a special advisor to the Middle East North Africa region at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. She served as a senior advisor for the International Crisis Group, and in 2018 was seconded by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the EU mission in Iraq. Adnan Tabatabai is a co-founder and CEO of the German-based Middle East think tank, which is called the Center for Applied Research and Partnership with the Orient, or CARPO. As an Iran analyst, he's consulted by European policymakers and businesses on Iran's domestic and international affairs. Through his work with CARPO, Adnan has designed and facilitated Track 2 and civil society dialogue formats between Iran and Saudi Arabia since 2015. Today's discussion will be moderated by Professor Vadi Nast, the Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS. For the audience, please know that you can write your questions throughout the event in the chat box on YouTube, and we will get to them during the Q&A portion of the event. Without further ado, I turn the mic over to Vadi.
Thank you very much, Nargis, and I also want to welcome our colleagues to this event. It's extremely timely. I was very excited, although, as I was mentioning to them earlier, we didn't plan it to be on such a historic day for Europe and Ukraine. But nevertheless, we're dealing with a very important topic that is of great importance to the future of the Middle East and Saudi-Iran relations, particularly in light of nuclear talks, are very important. We know that there have been conversations between the two countries, a set of dialogues that have been taking place in Iraq, and I would like to come back to that and discuss it with our participants. But I want to start by asking each of you to first tell us very briefly, what do you think is the fundamental issue between the two countries as things stand right now? In other words, as they're planning to meet in Baghdad, and they have already had these conversations, what is really the core issue for each side? And Adnan, perhaps you can focus on the Iran side, and HESHAM and Maria can speak more on Saudi Arabia, but also maybe a broader set of regional issues. So HESHAM, let me start with you. If you can tell us, what do you think is the sort of the core issue for Saudi Arabia in terms of the future of its relationship with Iran?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Very glad to be here. It's good to be with you and my distinguished colleagues today. Allow me first to say that I think it's crucial to focus on initiating a common ground, as it's easy to exchange accusations. What is difficult, in my opinion, is talking to each other rather than talking at each other. And I hope also that such public events on this specific topic becomes contagious and replicate. Due to the time limitations, I will try to answer your question and provide also a very brief reading of the current scene between the two states. I will also offer my view or maybe projection of what should we expect in the near future. I will attempt to be specific. I will avoid cliches, although I'm aware that being specific would make it easier to counter the things I say, but this is the proper way to go, in my opinion, and a risk worth taking, especially with many negative claims and rumors circling around. The good news, it seems to me that we're witnessing the beginning of a move away from the zero-sum game that governed the relationship between the kingdom and the Islamic Republic. And despite the escalation we see on many fronts and the major fundamental challenges facing us related to the structure of the region, as this is not the European Union, or maybe this is not a good example now, but anyways, I think it's fair to assume that both states at least understand now that direct communication is necessary. So there were several official, as you mentioned, engagements on different levels, high to mid-level, mainly security intelligence meetings. And it's crucial, I think, to distinguish between Iraq and also Oman and Jordan. These are not just different venues for the same thing. Until now, we had four rounds of talks in Iraq. These were moderated by the Iraqi Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi himself. In Jordan, there were academics and subject matter experts, an intellectual gathering purely, no current officials. I was there, so I can confirm that. And to reduce the noise, if you allow me to say, I have to say that there are many such conferences now, and that cannot even, and Adnan can also comment on this, that cannot even qualify as track 2 or a proper back channel, because track 2 have distinctive characteristics and attributes that do not fit or apply to such meetings. There was also mid-level operational meetings in Oman, official meetings, but not as significant as the ones in Iraq. Why do we have Oman in addition to Iraq? My sincere and direct explanation is that this is an indication of the seriousness of these talks, which reflects a strong intentions and tendency to de-escalate. And if this to happen, it requires iterations and continuity. Anything can interrupt these talks should be overcome and dealt with right away. So Oman can be a main stage of talks if it's not possible in Iraq for any reason, security-wise or because any delay related to the government formation. Then Oman would be another established venue for the meeting. And unlike what we hear, that there are no benefits of previous rounds, the obvious initial result is the arrival of the 3 Iranian diplomats in the kingdom to take up post at the headquarters of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So what to expect in the new rounds? In regards to timing, because there was a delay. And I think the coming round should happen after the formation of the Iraqi government. And my forecast is that the focus will be on the resumption and normalization of diplomatic relations in the coming rounds. And yes, in my view, a breakthrough is more likely than not. Both parties have enormous benefit in breaking the current pattern of maintaining the status quo, regardless of what deal we get in Vienna. And if this breakthrough happens, with all the serious and legitimate concerns that the Saudis have, I would say that the ball is in Iran's court, with the issues that you asked about. So when opportunity presents itself, I hope that Iran sees it, initiate a paradigm transformation from conflict to cooperation, from zero-sum to a win-win situation. The momentum of the nuclear deal should be used also to build the regional security architecture. Working in a functional deal is possible, in my opinion. And this could be in a form of a regional peace initiative. I can come to this later on in our discussion. But in my view, establishing diplomatic relations is not far away. As I said, regardless of what happens in Vienna, I think official channels and bilateral relations between the kingdom and Iran is in itself necessary before discussing any core issues between the two countries. I say this knowing that obstacles and differences are still too many. And actually, I do not want to repeat them here in this talk. And confronting the militias and finding a way to deal with the security-related threats will persist from the Saudi side. But international relations are all about gray zones. The most competitive interactions between states operate in this realm of vagueness or ambiguity. And let me emphasize that diplomatic ties do not mean that the two states will be allies. Actually, active communication between rivals is more important than friends. Also, the fluidity of relations in the region now is astonishing. The Turks, the Israelis, different Gulf states, the shifting sands require at least a tactical understanding between the kingdom and Iran for the benefit of both. As the battle is extremely expensive, I would argue a higher cost on Iran, but this is a different debate. I'll conclude without going into much details. Foreign policy is a reflection of local needs. there are issues and great issues between the two countries, but this applies to both sides. And I think the opportunities are endless, but it definitely takes two to tango. Achieving a regional economic understanding and good governance, departing the rentier model and post-oil economy is extremely difficult. And I would say actually threatening to the survival of the regimes and state institutions, and will require cooperation. No single state in the region can do this alone. And the Saudis, I'll conclude with this. The Saudis have no illusions about changing Iran and how difficult this will be. But they also have no illusions that there are those who want peace and a better future inside Iran and elsewhere in the region. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for setting the scene, and I think you laid it out very interestingly, rather than focusing on maximal issues of, like, let's say, solve Yemen, etc., on literally what can be gained immediately. So, and I would like to come back to some of the issues you raised, but so Maria, maybe I can go to you, and you can similarly give us a sense of where things stand. What's the core issues, and how do you see the lay of the land?
Thank you, Vali, and thank you for SAIS for organizing this meeting. Well, I think that the matter at the beginning was really that one of creating the optic of a solution, more than actually solving the strategic differences between these two players. This we have seen that from the time that the talk started a year ago up until recently, basically these talks continued on the sideline of an ongoing competition happening still in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon. So, but I still concur with what HESHAM said, that I think that there are certain strategic changes that are happening at the macro level that are external, that can really play in favor of pushing these two players and encouraging these two players to shift from a rather, uncommitted dialogue to a more serious line of communication that is sustainable and that is serious. And I think that I will identify at least a couple of points that can help this to increase the seriousness of dialogue between the two players that are external. I mean, one, I think, is the real what we are witnessing to these days, and also in the last 6 months, the fact that we are seeing that the Middle East is really shifting towards the periphery of the global attention to some extent. We are seeing U.S. disengagement. We have seen it with Afghanistan, and we are seeing to this day that the key issues when a war in Ukraine is happening, that the key issue is actually that the Western interests, the strategic interests are at stake, the future of NATO, and so on. So all these things, I think that they really sort of push the Middle East towards really almost the periphery of the global attention. And also, of course, they leave a strategic vacuum within the region. And I think that with this US disengagement, you have a really difficulty to see other global players who can fill that gap, because we don't see Russia doing that. We don't see China doing that. We rather see that this gap actually it's left to be filled by different regional players. And let me come to the second point, which I think that because this gap is left to be filled by different regional players, I think that both Saudi Arabia and Iran are actually going to see many of their own competitors to actually getting prominent into this space, and therefore maybe they will have interest in actually getting to talk together, because on the one hand we see that actually smaller within the GCC intra-relationship, we see that the smaller GCC states are getting more powerful, more prominent. Qatar with an important role in global diplomacy that played in Afghanistan, UAE with very, very agile diplomacy. So these are all competitors for Saudi Arabia, in my view. And on the other hand, you see that also the Iranians, I think, are not in a very good situation, because because Turkey is going to be having an increasingly important role. Already in the past months, we have seen stepping up influence in the strategic zone of influence of Iran, northern Iraq, northern Syria, and with the Ukraine crisis, definitely is going to put Turkey in a very prominent position as the kingmaker, sort of the key player within the NATO alliance, and therefore with more leverage vis-a-vis of Europe and with more leverage to operate in Iraq and in Syria. Therefore, both Saudi Arabia and Iran really, they have their competitors within their areas of influence, and that can really be an incentive to get together in some way of talking really more seriously between each other. Third, I would say that both Iran and Saudi Arabia, they have domestic challenges, or like they have challenges anyway to face. I can see, but then, I mean, we have more time later to discuss this, but I mean, Saudi Arabia is very engaged into the implementation of the Vision 2030. There is an entire also focus inward that it's also taking a lot of attention and energy. And Iran also is dealing with the many issues. I mean, they have supported for several years so many players across the region, non-state armed groups and so on. But now these players, from the Hashd al-Shab in Iraq to the Houthis to Hezbollah, they also have their own, to the militia in Syria, they have their own local interests that are not necessarily in line with the priority of Iran. They are playing their own. We can see now in Iraq, the priority of the Hashd al-Shab is not necessarily in line with that one of the Iranians. So there is a management issue over there that I think puts a lot of pressure on Tehran. So this, some of the points really that are external, really, that can really push these two players to come together. And last but not least, of course, I think a more stable US policies vis-a-vis of the region, whether it is on the one hand with diplomacy of the ending in a good terms the JCPOA, finalizing the JCPOA, having a clear line for disengagement, and also at the same time continuing with the de-escalation policy will also play an important role in having both Iran and Saudi Arabia to adjust and to understand for Saudi Arabia that they cannot anymore count on the US as a protector, and that Iran, that finally, I mean, they don't necessarily have to focus only on getting the US out of the region, that there is a different game at play, and they really need to come together with the Saudis really to sort of find and define the strategic line of influence across the region. But again, the final line, I will say that I think that for a certain time along the way, we will see that this line of communication has really potential to evolve into something serious, but definitely the main strategic interest of these two players will not be resolved anytime soon. But I think that we have to give hope to the line of dialogue anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting points. I mean, I always would think that if the Vienna talks got somewhere, I mean, either Iran's path to the world has to go through the Arab world and its Arab neighbors, or through Turkey. And so there's sort of a competition that you mentioned between Turkey trying to sit in the middle of the Middle East, or Saudi Arabia be the power that sits in the middle with relations with everybody is going to be interesting, and relations with Iran is very key to that. Adnan, I mean, both Hesham and Maria raised a lot of interesting issues about, you know, both the regional dimension and also how Saudi Arabia right now sees the sort of the chessboard before it. So I wanted to ask you about, first of all, just like Hesham laid out, what do you think is Iran's game plan at this point in time in these talks? What do they want? But I also, listening to Maria, wonder how much of the geostrategic issues that she raised is part of the conversation in Iran. In other words, is that a motivating factor? Do they also look at the region and look at Turkey and look at these changes and see that as a sort of elements of a grand strategy going forward? And finally, one of the issues that Hesham raised is, I think, germane, that, you know, we know still very little about the Raisi government, and do you see difference between the approach of this new leadership group in Iran and the ones who actually started perhaps the talks or the engagement in Iraq? And is it more hopeful, less hopeful as we go forward?
Thank you, dear Vali, and thanks to your entire team for setting this up. I'm really happy and proud to be with all of you and with Maria and Hesham. Yeah, let's try to navigate through the great list of questions and issues you raised. So on the one hand, I really think what makes me hopeful when looking at Tehran and at the inner Iranian discourse is that even though Iran views regional issues in its neighborhood still primarily through the lens of the US threat or the threat perceived by the US, Iran has increasingly understood and appreciated and acknowledged the creative shaping of policies by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Iran increasingly has appreciated in the past 4 or 5 years that really those two countries can also shape US politics towards Iran. This has led to an understanding and the necessity in Iran to really spend more time thinking about the UAE and Saudi Arabia in their own right and give them more agency in regional affairs. This to me is important because this means that there is more brain cells in Tehran invested into how to engage Riyadh, and that stick to Riyadh, obviously, for this event. And I think that the lessons of 2019, let's call them euphemistically lessons. I'm talking about the escalation in the Strait of Hormuz and the attacks that happened. I think these sent a strong signal. There was also the strong signal that the US is not going as far as many had expected in defending their allies or in trying to push back against any sort of threat against their allies. And I think the lessons of 2019 have been learned on all sides, in Riyadh, in Tehran, and Abu Dhabi as well. Then we had the pandemic, obviously, which had held its own challenges to the region and to Iran in particular. And if I look at the discourse of the international think tank scene or the Iranian think tank scene dealing with international affairs in Tehran, there are a few buzzwords that are really coming up increasingly. And one of those is I have the sense that in terms of military posture in the region, Iran is saturated. We can discuss this later, what I exactly mean by that, but Iran feels that its posture is, so to speak, sufficient, let's call it this way. And that now the shift has to happen towards more political engagement. Iran has understood that it has not won the hearts and minds of countries where it either has influence or actual presence. So there might be a shift in my view. The second thing is that regional multilateralism is something that the Iranians view as a positive and as a constructive response to globalization. And that having intensified relations, and this is mainly seen as economic relations with immediate neighboring countries, and this is not only with countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, but really also to its eastern and northern borders, in trying to explore new avenues for trade relations is something that Iran views as being necessary. And the one theme that, because we mentioned Vienna and the nuclear talks, the one theme that is extremely prevalent is the theme of neutralizing sanctions, khonsasazi tahrim ha, as it is said in Farsi. So it's no longer just about trying to get sanctions lifted, it's about a long-term strategy, a bit of a utopia, obviously, to try to shield the country completely from the impact of sanctions. But how do you do that? Partly by expanding economic relations to immediate neighbors, exploring new trade avenues that can be shielded against sanctions. And this includes trade relations with Saudi Arabia in whatever way they can be developed. I think Hesham is absolutely right. We will have to wait and see what the Iraq government will look like. Like, the chances of Mustafa al-Kadhimi against all odds are not that bad, and that he can continue to be the host of Iran-Saudi talks. It was already mentioned that those attending those talks were military and security and intelligence officials. I call them track 0.5. And to me, those guys are exactly the right ones to start these conversations before elevating them to the political level. I think we are already in such an advanced stage of these talks that even the dangerous attacks of the Houthis to Abu Dhabi, and then there were reports about Hashid also attacking the UAE, this did not lead to public condemnation of Emirates or Saudi officials against Iran being behind this attack or having supported these groups. And this in itself, in spite of the climate still being explosive, as it has been outlined by both Hesham and Maria, shows you that there is some seriousness in these talks. So therefore, I'm quite positive about them resuming. Very briefly, before ending, on what can be the subject of the discussions. To Iran, the two most important and sensitive contexts will be Iraq and Afghanistan as immediate neighbors. Here, I see a lot of common ground for Iran and Saudi Arabia, some competition when it comes to Iraq, obviously, and the Iraqi economy, a discussion we can lead later. In Afghanistan, I see a lot of convergence of interests. Both countries do not want Afghanistan to become a hub for Daesh, Khorasan, for example. Lebanon and Syria will be more difficult, but again, and I will end on this, in Tehran, there was a positive reaction to the Saudi intel chief going to Syria, playing their part in reintegrating Bashar al-Assad into the Arab League. I think this is something that Iran welcomes. So I see a lot of common ground, but obviously against all the odds of what can be difficult. Final point, if I may. Europe, the West, the US, should this process just go for itself, back off, don't even try to support it. You'll only do harm to this process. This is a regionally owned dialogue channel, and it should be shielded from third parties that might actually do more harm than good to this process. Back to you, Vali.
Thank you. Thanks. That's very instructive. I mean, I'm actually a little bit pleasantly surprised that all this talk of positive momentum that we are seeing from all sides is not contingent on the outcome of a very difficult case of how do you end the war in Yemen, which often, at least in the United States, is assumed to be the beginning point rather than an end point. And I have to say, I think the way both you and Hesham had outlined it, at least the way the capitals see it, the idea of building from below on small steps and expanding it seems to be more sustainable than putting a lot on solving a critical, a very large, complex issue like a war. But there is another issue on the table, which is important, I guess, for Iran and for the region, and that's what's happening in Vienna. And unlike what Adnan said about the Baghdad talk, that's all about the Europeans and the Americans. So I wanted to start with Hesham and ask you, I mean, we are talking even about an imminent potential deal, although we don't know what the shape of it would be, to see, first of all, what is the Saudi view beyond rhetorical things that they may say in public, really about a deal in Vienna, and how this might be different from the way they received JCPOA in 2015. And then if you want to sort of reflect how this might impact the Baghdad talks, at least one rumor has been that part of the delay in the next meeting has had to do with the fact that Vienna seems to be at a critical stage.
Okay. Allow me. I just want to say something about.
Please,
I agree with most of what Adnan said, except Syria. I think it's a little bit early to claim that there is this Syria-Saudi reapproachment or integration. And on Vienna, allow me also for a late disclaimer. Everything I say or maybe predict is my own. Of course, I think it's accurate. Sure. Otherwise, I would not have said it. But events that follow could go against some of these details that I propose. But as I said, I think it's always a good practice to present specifics that are evidence-based. Hopefully, it wouldn't be misleading. And maybe this is not what you usually hear, but having a deal is the preferred outcome, especially for the Saudis. No sane person would say that nuclear Iran loose with no deal, no restrictions, is in the interest of the kingdom. Of course, this could be a temporary solution and a burden for a future US administration when the deal expires. But the Saudis are aware of that. The Saudis were not absent in Vienna. If they were not present in the same room there where the action is, they are in the room next to it. I'm not saying that the Saudis think that a nuclear deal will solve their issues, the regional problems, specifically with Iran. No, I'm not saying that. This will be very misleading, but everyone, I think, should be reasonable and productive. A nuclear deal will be phase one, or a major step in the right direction. Phase two should be a regional deal. So in general, it seems to me that Saudis will be welcoming and supportive of the deal. But at the same time, they will hold everyone to their words. World powers, Iran. I think that the day after the deal is what's important. Confidence building measures, a regional peace initiative, a sustained de-escalation that leads to peace and economic integration in the region. And if you allow me to add, the goal is a sustainable solution. Whatever you think of Trump withdrawing from the nuclear deal, Trump could not have done it if it was a robust agreement. Iran, the whole region, would have benefited more from a deal that could pass a Senate vote. We want the primary sanctions to be lifted. And we also want Iran to give us assurances, commitments to the security of the region, and through legitimate means, not through sponsoring proxies, such as what's happening now. If you wish, I could also speak about the source of the conflict, actually, very briefly. And I must say, because I hear this all the time, I must say that the whole narrative that this is a Sunni-Shi'i conflict and the West is innocent, I think is a total fantasy. It's not Omar against Ali. It's not a closed identity crisis. This is not an acceptable way to look at it. Actually, I think it's very offending to the people of the region. There are many reasons of the conflict. One of the main sources, in my opinion, of the conflict is this, and me personally participated in several track 2 sessions, and I always hear this from my Iranian colleagues. There is this Iranian belief or perception seeing Saudi as part of the Western bloc. And I think that the West is hugely responsible in this conflict. Large part of the issue is this association between Saudi and the US. This association resulted in an attack on Saudi oil infrastructure. 7 million barrels go through Bghaik. This association was also used for decades in attacking the political security of the kingdom, targeting the legitimacy to govern Mecca and Medina. The question now, I think, is this association correct? I don't think it's fair to blame the kingdom for the mistakes of the West. But this is for a different discussion. I think we're witnessing now a great shift in the region, and everybody should seize this opportunity and this opening window.
Thank you. So, Maria, similar question that I put to Hesham. I mean, if particularly, you might also reflect on how Europe and potentially US's attitudes towards this dialogue or the region may change if there is a deal or if there isn't a deal in Vienna, and see how the picture that you drew of the geostrategy of the region may actually change in light of Vienna.
Thank you, Vali. Well, I think that the deal, it's at least when it's done, it's a constant in a world of many variables. So at least it introduces an element, a solid element, or quite solid element from which to start more seriously. And so I think it's in that sense, I see that, and it's also, I mean, it's a constant, not only in the relation between Iran and the US, or Iran and Europe. It's also introduces a constant or a more stable variable, let's say, in the relation between Iran and Saudi Arabia itself and the Gulf in general. So I think that definitely it's something that it's a preparatory steps towards what are more serious talks. However, let me also add that the step between, even when the deal is done and even when there is this favorable environment for talks becoming more serious, the steps towards really achieving something are more difficult than it looks like. And honestly, I think that, I mean, we were mentioning before, for example, Iraq, and, you know, I mean, even there now with the process of government formation, it's quite clear that you have not rather a coexistence between the Iranians and then the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, but rather a polarization where some of the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, I think that they are seeing an opportunity also to increase influence and also in some way maybe to push a little bit aside or at least diminish the influence that Iran may have. So, and this is not only happening in Iraq, is happening it happens also in other states. I mean, this competition is still ongoing, so it's very much also dependent. It happens in Lebanon, it happens in Yemen. So, I mean, again, despite this line of communication, I still think that both from the Saudi and the Iranian perspective, in my view, there is still an attempt of seeing, well, how can we push the strategic line of each one of us, you know, a little bit on our own interest when it comes to the regional scene. And I think that when it comes to Europe and its engagement post JCPOA, I might concur with what Hisham was mentioning, that not always, I mean, that definitely this chaos or like the absence of a regional security architecture is not something just that we should blame on the regional players. In some way, I think that also we see that Europe is taking a new interest to the Gulf. There has been several meetings, several travels also to the Gulf capitals, and also Gulf foreign ministers have visited Brussels. But still, I do see that this approach also towards an engagement in the Gulf, European states, they take it yet in a very unstructured manner, sometimes more going bilaterally than actually as a unified bloc. And sometimes actually they steer the competition between the different Gulf states rather than, you know, helping a cohesive approach. So I'm totally concurring with the idea that sometimes actually the West, it's part of the problem. Thank you.
Excellent. So Adnan, similarly, I wanted for you to sort of explore, you know, how does Vienna play into or what may come out of Vienna, whether there's a deal or there isn't a deal, into the way Iran is playing the regional relations and where it might go with Saudi Arabia.
Look, I think the first and probably most important point is that a successful revitalization of the deal will immediately mean an easing of tensions between Iran and the US. And those have played out mostly on Iraqi territory or in other countries of the region of Iran's neighborhood. So if those tensions if those tensions started to ease, that I believe is good news and will catalyze this process and the willingness from Iranians to seek to expand political ties to their neighbors. Iran will not commit the same mistake it did in 2015 to basically neglect every neighbor to its east and just look towards Europe for normalizing trade. Iran has learned its lessons. Iran, and this is what President Raisi said on the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. He basically said that Iran, he paraphrased it, but he was basically saying that Iran is not going to put all the eggs in the basket of Europe and the West. So this mistake will not be committed again. Let's also not forget that a lot of messages from Tehran vis-a-vis the JCPOA have been issued during a state visit to Qatar or Oman just very recently. And this is also a strategy the Iranians are adopting to basically take regional neighbors on board this time. It's obviously not possible to do that in Riyadh yet, But I think Iran has also understood, even though they may not admit it in public messaging, that the region has to be somehow embraced more when it comes to the JCPOA. And that may then open the room to discuss regional affairs in which Iran and its presumed rivals have common ground. Back to you, Vali.
And what if the JCPOA falters, or it doesn't? We don't arrive at a deal next week.
Again, I really think that this long-term goal of neutralizing sanctions, something that Iran needs, will drive Iran to seek economic integration in its immediate neighborhood, and to, for the first time, we may argue, put economy before security when it comes to immediate neighborhood relations. This is why I'm hopeful, even if the JCPOA was to fall apart, which I don't think will happen.
Very good. So I have many more questions, but I want to just check in with Nargis to see if there are questions from the audience we should turn to.
There are a lot of them are already actually being covered with your questions, Vadi. So I would say continue, and I'll let you know if there's others that come up. Okay,
so it would be remiss of me if I don't ask you today, of all days, what do you think might be the impact of the war in Ukraine on the region and on the scenario we're seeing? I mean, there's obviously U.S. attention, there's Russian attention. And I'm also curious to see how each of you think the different capitals read just what's happening in Ukraine in terms of their own security, regional stability, etc. So let me start with you, Hesham. And it's just good to know, like, how does Saudi Arabia see this event, aside from what it means for Iran? In other words, how does it interpret this major change in the way in which we've anticipated stability in Europe?
The Saudis, till now, the official statements are very neutral. So there is no clear position until now. No sidelining with any of the sides. But if you allow me, I would integrate what the Russian role and what I see as a regional security architecture, because we always hear that the comprehensive, and I hate using this word, but a comprehensive deal is necessary. However, the question that is usually avoided, why would Iran give up on the militias? This is a very useful tool, low cost, high return. With all the agency that the Houthi has, Yemen is a good example. Mm-hmm. And I acknowledge that it wouldn't be easy to deal with this issue. But the international arena is a jungle. We saw what happened to Ukraine. But the international community, the Chinese and the Russians, maybe not the Russians now, but they have to raise the cost on Iran. Not because anyone wants to harm Iran, but because this will be counterproductive, I think. But to steer it away from relying on the militias in a rational manner. And I think that this is achievable. And in every way you look at it, the battle with the Saudis especially, and others in the region, is not cheap. Adnan alluded to that. Even if you think you're winning in the short term, security is one of the prerequisites of healthy societies and an Islamic principle that also societies and states seek. And I think this region has a chance in having peace, maybe more than Europe now. And confidence building process I think is a mutual and a cumulative, gradual, long-term effort. And if diplomatic relations are back, problems will remain. I want to be clear on this. Without addressing the cause of the issue, the conflict will fester and explode, as we saw what happened in Ukraine. It will be a different infection each time in this region. So the way forward, in my opinion, is a regional dialogue that leads to a regional security initiative, a non-aggression pact. And this regional initiative can be and should be supported by world powers, including China and also Russia. Why would a nuclear deal be possible while other parts related to security are difficult? A comprehensive approach, security covering not only the political dimensions. We have serious issues in this region, more than Europe. It's economy, it's the environment, the human dimension, it's water security, especially for Saudi and Iran. Both have this issue. Yeah, when the nuclear deal was a product of global cooperation, global and regional cooperation that address Iran concerns, and I stress on that accommodate and minimize its fears is needed and possible, in my opinion. This will be reflecting and changing the so-called forward defense, offensive defense creed that Iran has, and ensure also the survival of the regime. In every crisis, whether it's in Ukraine or in our region, there is an opportunity. Russia, China, among others, already declared on several occasions that they want to participate in such initiative without going into details. And both are close to Iran and also to the kingdom. The Saudis are ready to start this regional security, in my opinion, dialogue and initiative on the basis that I do not want to bind you to something that I'm not committed to. And I think this is fair to all sides and achievable and possible at the current moment.
Very interesting. So just a quick follow on, HESHAM. What is the Saudi public opinion on all of this? I mean, there was a time, let's say, a year or two ago, where you had a sense that Saudi public opinion, Iranian public opinion, were hardening towards one another. I'm just as you are talking about all of these possibilities, and I'm going to ask the same question of Adnan and Maria as well. What do keep? Is there support? Is it softening towards building relations with Iran?
And I think there is this public awareness with this and this shifting sands and changing dynamics in the whole world. People seek first economic prosperity, and they know that this wouldn't be achievable without regional economic integration. Also, the disengagement of the West, the US specifically, requires different and new understandings in the region. People, I think it's new paradigms are. This is the moment to push forward for these new paradigms and for this conflict resolution or transformation. And I think it's possible and easy when people see the fruits of it. And the Iranians are not. And as I said, it's not a Sunni Shi'i conflict. It's not something. It's not this Orientalist view of it. It's something I find it very offending. And I think it's a political matter, political security. And if we have solutions to the issues that we have now in the region, then people will be acceptable of it.
Okay. So Maria, I mean, similarly, I want you to address the Ukraine issue I raised, but you're also sitting somewhere else in the region. So I'm curious to also what your read is of what popular opinion is about this kind of a rapprochement. Again, at the height of the Syria war, I remember that public opinion in the Arab world was quite hardened against Iran and its interference in the war and support for Assad. But just what's the mood at this point in time about where things are going?
Vali, I will first maybe address the issue of the Ukraine. Because
yes, please. I want you to do both.
The European, we are actually sitting on a very, anyway. I think, look, on the Ukrainian issue, I think that honestly, it's a key, it's a major, historical, event that is happening. I mean, basically, when the Baghdad conference, the Baghdad summit was organized, Macron was there. It was a moment 7 months ago, that we thought Europe is going to be able to project strategic power to the region in autonomy from the NATO alliance, from the Atlantic alliance. I mean, what's happening to this moment is just totally killing that. And I think it's just pushing back Europe under the NATO umbrella for the better over the good. But this means also that project that started, that discussion that started of a Europe that is more autonomous, strategically autonomous from the US when it comes also to engaging the region, it's actually frozen, at least at the moment. And I think that means also that the flashpoint of attention of Europeans, okay, we are engaging Iran, we are engaging the Gulf, but the flashpoint of attention is Eastern Europe, is what's happening at our own border as Europeans. So again, I think that this also has impact on Europe and on the region, because I think that as the attention and the focus of Europeans is going to be what's happening at our own eastern border, it means that we are going to leave more leeway to actually some other players like Turkey actually to operate and to expand the influence in the space of Iraq and Syria. This is why I was mentioning before that I think one of the major consequences will be that Turkey will have a strong leeway now to operate as a member of Atlantic Alliance, to expand its influence in the Levant, and this will definitely raise its strategic importance. And when it comes to who is going to be actually sort of benefiting from it, I had alluded in my first intervention. I think, as I said, Turkey, but also these smaller players like Qatar, they are already like very active in trying to have a role as a mediator, so I do think that actually the winners are the smaller players rather than Saudi Arabia itself. But this is why I think that we come to the last point that I wanted to mention, that unless actually this line of communication between the Saudi Arabia and Iran is not successful, I mean, if it is successful, at least it can, I think, prevent the region to really becoming a backyard of some of the backlash that also can derive from this conflict that are happening in other places. I'm not exactly a believer that a regional security architecture could be exactly possible at this moment, but I do think that the tensions that are happening in Ukraine should, and I hope will, actually encourage these big players, whether it's Saudi Arabia and Iran as the first nucleus, but also the other major players within the region, to actually come together and to prevent and to make less vulnerable this region from festering crisis. Because otherwise, I just see this region becoming less of an interest for the US, for Europe, and some conflict like Yemen and Syria just continuing to fester, and other semi-authoritarian regime just to be tolerated, continuing to exist tolerated, because anyway the West has sort of given up on the Middle East. This is a bit the posture that is now dominant. Therefore, I think, as Adnan and Hisham said, this should be, I mean, the players, the major regional players of the region should take their own future in their own hand, definitely. Thank you.
Very, very interesting. So Adnan, in Iran, Iran's close relations with China and Russia have for a while been controversial at a public level. There's a lot of debate about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. So I'm curious to know how Ukraine will play into this calculation. But at the same time, some of the issues that Hisham raised are important in the sense that it's a question as to whether the strategy of relying on militias, etc., domestically has also reached its limits. I mean, earlier on there were protests a number of years ago about Iran's support for Lebanon, Iraq, etc. But even in terms of the ability of the Revolutionary Guards to pursue this strategy without domestic opposition. Do you see it that way? And does the Iranian public opinion actually matter in the way in which this thing will go forward?
Thank you, Vali. Well, I mean, the public opinion, public views used to matter a lot in Iran. We could argue that the last 2 years that has significantly decreased when we look at how the elections were held and how the elections went. But at this point, I would still say public attention, public opinion matters, and there is at least the necessity for the state elite to respond to public perceptions of certain issues. And obviously, the invasion of Russia into Ukraine will be seen in a very negative light in Iran. Iranian officials, just like the Saudi officials, Hisham mentioned it, have tried to be as balanced as possible. So Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian basically said, the reason for this crisis are the politics by NATO, and yet resorting to war is nothing Iran would condone. So there is certainly this attempt to try and appear balanced. And some are now saying, look, the Ukraine is learning the hard way that the West is unreliable, and they will certainly try to benefit from this also by basically saying, look at what happened in Afghanistan, and now the situation in the Ukraine shows that basically there is no way that the West comes to your protection when it's actually needed. Very, very briefly, I know time is running out, on the militias and the network or the axis of resistance. I don't think it's realistic to think Iran would give up this structure, so to speak. But what does it mean in terms of trying to find a way to do no harm to each other? And I think this is exactly where we need to calibrate our expectations. Not giving up on something doesn't mean to utilizing it. So this is, I believe, something that the Iranian and Saudis will have to discuss for the years to come, not only in the next round that hopefully will happen sometime in spring. Back to you, Vali.
Thank you. Let me turn it over to Narges for last questions and last thoughts.
Sure. So thank you so much for everyone for a wonderful conversation. The audience was asking a lot of questions, but honestly, Vali was already covering a lot of those in his questions. So we didn't want to be redundant, but there are two that didn't get covered. And I know we don't have much time. I'll just pose these two from the audience and let whoever would like to take them. One is a question from one audience member that asked, is it possible for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to turn away from the Abraham Accords towards one that promotes regional cooperation, such as the Baghdad dialogues? And the other, I think you all have touched upon it, but not as directly. So if the desire by both parties is to negotiate based on their reading of the US regional policy to disengage, then what would happen in the midterms that are coming up and in 2024 if there's going to be a Republican-dominated Congress and a Republican presidency, similar to what we had with Trump before? Whoever would like to take any of those questions is welcome.
Hisham, you go for the first question.
Actually, I want to comment about Yemen, if you allow me. I think we did not speak about Yemen.
Sure, please.
I think a political solution is needed, as this war has no end to it, and but this doesn't mean that this will stop establishing these diplomatic relations between the kingdom and Iran. In Yemen, we have a state that fights gangs. The Houthi is outside the international sphere, and he seeks to replicate the example of Taliban, while the Saudis, the coalition, cannot operate outside international legal bounds. The conflict also gives the Houthi privileges that he doesn't want to give up. So even if Iran wasn't involved, the Houthi will continue, and the message also is sent to other groups, including Daesh. Just wait long enough, and eventually you will win. On the other hand, why would someone expect the Saudis to just disengage from Yemen? Yemen is the kingdom's soft spot. It's not the Saudi backyard. It's a Saudi living room, a major national security interest with high cost, almost no return. The opposite from the Iranian side. On top of this, the Saudis are held accountable for every breath they take, but Iran is using Yemen for their forward defense. This equation has to change. It's difficult to change it, but it has to change. Otherwise, the conflict will continue despite having some sort of relations between the kingdom and Iran. And on the Abrahamic Accord, I know that this is a sensitive question, but the Saudis until now, and even during Trump time, did not go ahead with the Abrahamic Accord. What the Saudis seek is a more regional security architecture that will benefit the whole region. This is the preferred goal and outcome that the Saudis seek.
Adnan, did you want to add anything to that, or Maria?
Please, Maria.
Before Adnan, I have just a comment, maybe final on the question on the US. So, but you go first.
Well, I would in general actually also think that this point of the Abraham Accords is important. That this is, I also heard in Iran, they would probably never say that officially, but the logic is there that they are recognizing there is not that much appetite in Saudi Arabia, in the kingdom, to follow suit with the UAE and Bahrain to normalize. And Iran is, I think, feeling that there is an opportunity to engage the Saudis and basically bring them closer to themselves rather than pushing them also in the hands of Israel. So I think this is how it plays out, and that might further incentivize Iran to seek these regional talks.
Yes, a last word maybe on the question regarding what will happen if the mood in Washington and the political wind in Washington changes, which I think it's a very good question, because it points to an important issue. And I think that in Riyadh, I think one of the major thinking is saying, okay, if actually can we revert to a maximum pressure policy if we have US support from Republican Congress, for instance. I think that here actually sits our conversation and say, I think that it will be important to make enough steps into the dialogue between these two players so that both Saudi Arabia and Iran will actually see more advantages in continuing that talk than in reverting to maximum pressure policy or any aggressive policy against each other.
That's a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Maria, for that comment. And thank you everyone who joined us today in the audience. But a special thank you to our excellent panelists for joining us and for providing such a rich conversation and learning opportunity for all of us.